Okay, just to finish Soil Horizon B. Soil Horizon B is a subsoil and it often has an orange color due to oxidation and rust. So this is going to be a typical profile. And if we look at the profile, you're going to see some more horizons. Remember, we just talked about horizon R is bedrock. We talked about how C is partially weathered rock. That's the first thing that's going to weather down from the bedrock. Then A forms as organic matter begins to be added to the soil, and that makes up our topsoil. And as more time goes by, that clay and some other nutrients are going to wash down out of the topsoil, and it's going to form another distinctive layer. And this is going to be Horizon B, which is our very clay-heavy layer. Now, just to add on to this, as the soil becomes more developed, we end up with an organic layer. It's usually within the top 2 inches. This is where we will have mostly decomposing leaves and other plant matter. This can be very thin in some soils, maybe even almost non-existent, and it can be very thick in other soils. It's not present in all soils. So if we don't have a lot of organic matter, we won't have an organic layer. I briefly talked about humus, and humus is a dark colored substance that forms as plant and animal remains decay. Humus is so necessary for the soil because it's going to create spaces in the soil for air and water that the plants need to access their roots. Humus also contains nutrients that plants need to grow, such as nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, and potassium, and these nutrients will make the soil fertile. Soil texture. You might remember seeing this picture before to try to show you the difference between the size of gravel, sand, silt, and clay. Remember, gravel would be the largest, clay would be the smallest. Texture depends on the size of different soil particles. Gravel is the biggest, sand, silt, and clay. Clay soil texture. Whenever we talk about the soil texture of clay, it's going to be very dense. It's going to be very heavy. If you've ever dug a hole to put a potted plant or something in your yard, and after you dug down several inches, you might run into this clay soil texture. It's going to be very heavy, very, very dense. It holds a lot of water. Clay particles are incredibly small, and because the particles are so small, there's not much space in between those particles. And if there's not much space in between the particles, there's not what we would call pore spaces or openings for air to travel down to the plant's roots. If clay has tiny particles and tiny pore spaces, those pore spaces fill up very quickly with water, and plants can actually drown in clay soils from lack of air. It literally has too much water. On the flip side, if we have a very sandy soil texture, it can be very coarse texture, it might feel kind of gritty. It's going to have a lot of pore spaces, and water is going to drain through it very quickly. Plants can die from a sandy soil texture as well from lack of water. And this is just a picture to illustrate this. If you look at this, in between the clay particles, they're so tiny they are able to pack very close together. And water can still travel through, but it takes a little bit more time for it to travel through these very small openings. With a little bit bigger particle like silt, you can see how much more pore space there is, and water can travel through more easily, but it's still not going to travel through incredibly quick. And then if we look at sand, the bigger the particle, the bigger